No.
No.
I don't want to fight.
Is this the gay episode?
Gifford Skinner grew up in the early part of the century. He was aware from a very early age that he was far more attracted to other boys than to girls, and that this made him different. But the world Gifford was growing up in thought very differently about men like him. People knew, of course, that men could and did have sex with one another, but they thought of this as a sin that any man could commit. The idea of separating out a particular group who were more than usually attracted to their own sex and giving them the label homosexual had not yet occurred to most people. So men like Gifford found it difficult to know what to call themselves.
No. First of all, the word was musical. They'd say, well, that was the polite euphemism. They'd say, is he musical? If they were discussing people, you would say, is he musical? Meaning to say, is he gay? Then, of course, the word so came in, which was really supposed to be done in almost a French way. Is he so? Rather politely.
Because they felt different, men like Gifford grouped together to form a small exclusive clique. Their way of life has given rise to many of the beliefs we hold today about gays. So we asked Gifford and his friend Benny to guide us round their world.
I know he did.
I don't know whether these are the...
The men who drank in the upstairs bar at JB's called each other sisters. That was because, since they had no other way of thinking of themselves, they assumed there must be some kind of intermediate sex, more like women.
This reminds you of old times, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And we used to sit here.
Do you remember Lady Lavender?
Oh, my dear, yes.
With the two white borzoi
Yes,
dogs?
yes. But do you know why she was called Lady Lavender? She came from Mitcham.
What's
Yes.
the...
Mitcham Lavender.
Oh, I
Yes.
see.
Well, I mean, people all had camp names, didn't they?
Well, yeah.
Yes, I was always known as May.
Were you? I didn't
Yes.
have a camp name.
Didn't you?
No.
Well, you probably didn't know about it. Everybody was Ethel and Kate and
Yes.
all that sort of thing.
Many of these men were in jobs in domestic service, for they were keen to be in the West End, near what we'd now call the gay scene. And so they would take these low-paid jobs which heterosexual men would not have accepted so readily. Their evenings off would follow a regular pattern, often beginning with tea at places like Lyons Corner House, dubbed the Lily Pond because of its popularity with camp men. The management tried to turn them away, unsuccessfully.
This was the corner house, Lyons Corner House, and of course you know that, don't you? Because you used to go to the Lily Pond the same as I did upstairs.
The first floor,
wasn't it lovely? Yes.
They had two entrances, didn't
Yes,
they?
yes.
And
Pure white.
they used to go up one entrance,
Yes.
and
If
the
they were bar-
floor manager didn't like the look of them, he barred them.
Yes.
Used to come outside, walk round to the other one, go up there, and they used to say, come in here, and the nippers used to, with the waitresses, remember the
Yeah,
nippers?
the nippers, they were charming.
Yes.
They always liked the gays, didn't they?
They always
Yes.
did, yes.
Once the pubs opened, Gifford and his friends would go on from Lyons to one of 3 or 4 favourite haunts.
Now, do you remember the...
Oh, that's the site of the lovely Cavour, my
Cavour
darling
bar.
Cavour bar, yes.
Remember walking down those
Yes,
stairs?
yes. Oh, didn't we have some wonderful time?
But Gifford and his friends didn't find sexual partners in bars like these. That's because sleeping with your friends was like sleeping with other women. They wanted real men, and those had to be found elsewhere.
Real men were more attractive because one wasn't attracted to one's contemporary sisters, gay people. I was once asked by one of my bits of trade. He said, "Well, why do you like going with me? Why don't you go with one of your friends? They're so elegant and attractive." Such as Jim, he would say, what's some name? And I'd say, oh my God, I wouldn't go to bed with her. But he could never understand it. They always thought it was rather strange that one should run the risk of taking a stranger back to one's home and instead of taking one of one's friends and doing the same thing. It was absolutely impossible, though. I couldn't consider such a thing. I really liked the real thing or nothing.
Despite the fact that all homosexual acts were against the law, it was surprisingly easy to find men who were prepared to have sex. They were mostly working class, and soldiers were especially obliging. The main reason why so many real men, even servicemen, were available was because most people then were unaware of the concept homosexual. It was possible for men to have homosexual experiences without feeling that it made them queer. This, plus the attraction of a little pocket money, meant that many men felt able to go to bed with people like Gifford without it affecting the way they thought of themselves.
Because you could often get two back at a time. Often they wouldn't separate, especially sailors. The rough people were quite conscious of the fact that they weren't gay and that they were only doing it for the two bob.
This brings back memories, Gifford.
Does it? Why?
Yes. Well, do you remember?
That's the Alhambra.
This is the Odeon now.
Yes.
But that was the Alhambra.
Yes. It was very much more ornate in those days,
Oh, it's
wasn't it?
beautiful Oriental
black
outside.
now, yes.
And I played in that theatre.
No.
Theatres like the Alhambra are fondly remembered by people like Gifford and Benny. For, since the public had no real idea that homosexual encounters took place, they could go on uninterrupted in the galleries while the audience were applauding the show.
Did you ever go in the theatre?
Oh, very many times, but it was for cruising, dear. It was very, very successful indeed. You couldn't go wrong.
Brilliant, where they had all those lovely Cochrane
Cochrane
shows.
reviewed.
So, although homosexuality was regarded as a sin and was severely punished by law, and although for many homosexually inclined men, the 30s must have been a time of ignorance, guilt and fear, for the few men who moved in the world of West End theatres, cafes and pubs, it seems in retrospect to have been a golden age.
Oh, and of course the times I've been down here, you know the roundabout round here. We didn't have any feelings of persecution at all, really. Not so much as we do today. We had the freedom of the West End, really, in certain hours. That would be from 7 o'clock, and the streets would be ours.
But even as Gifford and Benny sipped their mixed vermouth in the Trocadero, the days of their free and easy little world were numbered. Society was about to discover the homosexual. That discovery brought their exotic lifestyle to an end, but the image they created is still influencing our view of homosexuality long after they have gone. Richard Krafft-Ebing, Havelock Ellis, and Sigmund Freud were the leaders of a new breed of scientists called sexologists, who devoted themselves to the study of human sexual behaviour. It was these men who began the process of discovering the homosexual. They had begun their work in the late 19th century, before the men who made up the gay scene of the 30s were even born. But their writings were to remain confined to intellectual circles for many years. At the time they wrote, science was just beginning to view human behaviour in a wholly new way, dividing people into different types, normal and abnormal, each with their own distinct personalities and even physical characteristics. The sexologists did the same for sex, and so people who preferred their own sex became homosexuals.
Before the 19th century, homosexual activities, homosexual practices existed, but the notion that there was such a person as the homosexual didn't exist. This is a relatively recent notion and is no older than about 100 years. What was punished was certain forms of homosexual activities, usually sodomy, in fact. But sodomy was a characteristic of, in a sense, of all sinful people. It wasn't a characteristic of a particular type of person. Whereas, increasingly, from the end of the 19th century, homosexuality is seen as the characteristic of a particular species, the species of the homosexual. What matters to the sexologists in the late 19th century, and in this century, in fact, is an attempt to define what's normal and what's abnormal. Now, this notion of normality is very much related to the much sharper definitions of masculinity and femininity in the course of the 19th century, and the bond that brings masculinity and femininity together, heterosexuality. And the homosexual, the description of the homosexual, is an attempt to fit a certain group of people into this notion that there are sharp divisions between male and female. And the only way you can do that in terms of social science is to say that certain people are somehow intermediate between real men and real women.
It was from the precursors of men like Gifford and his friends that the sexologists got most of their ideas about homosexuals. When they saw that effeminate sisters had sex with masculine trade, they concluded there must be two sorts of homosexual, and they called them inverts and perverts.
Essentially, the notion of inversion was invented by the sexologists at the end of the 19th century to describe those people they saw as inherently homosexual, people whose homosexuality was inborn, congenital. The notion of perversion was an attempt to explain, a feeble attempt to explain, those people who they saw not as inborn homosexuals, but those who were corrupted into homosexuality, either through inadequate parents or through corruption in youth or through bad influences in adulthood. So you get this sort of dichotomous version developing of the real homosexual who has to be pitied and the person who is potentially corruptible into it, who has to be protected.